before the presentations, I will take a couple of minutes to explain the spirit in which this roundtable was organized. As part of the Western canon, even an iconoclastic part, critical theory inherited the canon's Eurocentrism. This is true in terms of its roots in the European Enlightenment, its major figures coming from Euro-American regions, and its universalist treatment of Euro-American capitalist modernity. In light of this, some argue that critical theory should be more or less abandoned entirely, and that we need to look toward theories and theorists from the global south instead. In response to these arguments, others argue that the strong charges of Eurocentrism are beside the point, that the critical theory is sufficiently broad, open, and liberating as to not warrant any such dismissal and replacement, and such a turn to Southern theory. So we have something of an either-or proposition in these ideas, either critical theory or Southern theory. But instead of reifying these divisions, we might consider opening up space for productive dialogue instead. What are some actual convergences and divergences between Southern and critical theories? What are some points of agreement, and how might points of difference be productively addressed? How can critical theories and Southern theories help each other become stronger? How might we decrease the distance between critical theory and Southern theory without one, until the distinction between the two is no longer meaningful, but without one consuming or destroying the other? How can critical theory provide a path for particular Southern theories to occupy more central positions in the theoretical debates within the universities of the metropole? And how can theories from the South breathe new life into critical theory and help it take steps toward globally wider and more robust foundations? This is the spirit in which this critical theory and Southern theory online roundtable was organized. And with that, we can go to our first presenter, which will be Bruno.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. I just noticed that since I look at my notes, I can't see all of you, but I think you can see me, right? So if I need to say something again, or please say so. But my work has focused on the philosophy of Paulo Freire, which is a way to put it in terms that are not common to the current studies in pedagogy, which take Paulo Freire as an author. In general, Paulo Freire is not considered a philosopher, and to put it in these terms, I construct arguments that touch precisely on the distinct views of theory that are involved in the discussion that Jeremiah proposes. At least I would say so. Paulo Freire, I believe you all are in some way familiar to his work as the author of Pedagogy of the Oppressed and the proposer of a pedagogy of liberation. But Paulo Freire is also a profound thinker and intellectual who engages in a number of critical authors and critical philosophies to think his pedagogy, and in particular was a thinker involved in articulating critical thinking in the context of Brazilian social problems and Brazilian educational contradictions, the contradictions of education in Brazilian society. In that way, I think I can place Paulo Freire as a thinker and as someone who theorizes from what Boaventura de Souza Santos and other authors are calling the global South, the epistemologies of the South. And of course, I'm not alone in this position, but I haven't yet seen, and I'm particularly concerned in thinking of such a mapping of of Paulo Freire as a thinker from the global south, but also as a philosopher from the global south. And in that way, I'm also thinking how to look beyond the duality of a critical theory uh, born from the metropole and a critical theory made from questions and problems, particular of the global south, or in specifically Brazilian reality, and in fact, even inside Brazil, some local regional questions, uh, which can be very clearly stated when you look at how his work began. Paulo Freire started thinking these questions in social movements. And Paulo Freire is actually, I would argue, um, a representative, I don't know if that's the best word, but someone who thinks the questions that were posed by a certain group of social movements in Brazil. In the early 60s, we had a number of social movements which later would all be grouped in a term called the movements of popular culture. Some of them had this name specifically attached to their social movements, but Paulo Freire was part of these movements, and they actually started what now is known as Paulo Freire's pedagogical work, and also his theoretical thinking, which uh, gives foundation to this pedagogical work. I studied that and proposed that in my PhD thesis. I don't know if, but it is in Portuguese. So if if you guys would like to take a look, I have an article in the Wiley Handbook of Paulo Freire, or edited by Professor Carlos Alberto Torres from UCLA, and it is called Paulo Freire and the Movements of Popular Culture's Educational Philosophy. That's also a term I'm thinking in a way that education, in a way that philosophy sort of to say that philosophy in Paulo Freire's work becomes pedagogy as a theory, and also it becomes education in a practical level. That is to say that the divide between philosophy as an abstract exercise of contemplation in Paulo Freire, despite some influences such as the existential Christianity, some influences which actually would pose otherwise. In his theoretical work, he actually tries to put these together, a philosophy of a practice of thinking. And in that way, I think I can dialogue with what Jeremiah is proposing, because to see that is to think of Paulo Freire not only as an author who has all this work, but as someone who is provoking us to think that the theorization of the world is, as he puts it in another work, a way to expand the reading of the word as a relation with our reading of the world. And the reading of the world is exactly this aspect that, in some senses, he would say is natural to the human beings, but then he tries to put it in different terms. He sort of abandons this naturalization of who human being is, sort of to put it as a being of relations. And this is and here you see the phenomenological aspect of what he is thinking. And in so, he understands that critical consciousness is a development of our modes of thought. And our modes of thought are an expression of our ways of living. So in this sense, I think he is already despite how much of this he is conscious of it or not, or how much of it he put in his works or not. Because of course, this is not a way to, reply Paulo Freire in any fashion, but I think he is already giving some way, giving some possibility of exploring the idea that theory itself, uh, and the rational reflection on rationality, which is what critical theory proposes, right? In, I think, so to say, is something that is done as a practice of one's engagement in reality. And when put in this way, I think we can now think a number of realities from the global south in which such an exercise is done. And particularly, I explore how this is done in Freire's work with the movements of popular culture as a historical perspective, and how I believe we can use this discussion on for philosophy in Brazil today, philosophy of education in particular, and also the discussion around how to teach philosophy. But I believe this is not, of course, limited to Paulo Freire's work. I think we can take of this what is best for us to take of this discussion is how it opens a possibility to think that to theorize is not only to systematically organize under one form of rationality, uh, but to think of different logical standpoints in which a dialogue is necessary. Of course, this is not an easy task. We are in so many ways thought of as lesser deserving thinking creatures in the South, and I think much of this has to do with modernity itself, and it it must be said that Paulo Freire is someone who was very much concerned of modernity, but also enforced a notion that modernity has an aspect of liberation. I think of this in when I see his position around uh, democratization of culture, when he makes the defense of public education, when he makes a defense of the human being as some incomplete project, but who must uh, work for the betterment of society. But at the same time, you have a negative moment in his thought, and to some extent influenced by critical theory. Um, at least he cites Marcuse at some point in the Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and he's influenced by these discussions, and he also uses Eric Fromm very much, right? From his first texts, Educação como prática de liberdade, education as a practice of liberation. I think something is translated to English in something like that. He also uses this distinction, and especially Fromm's book Escape from Freedom, which he uses to to discuss the notion of liberty and how liberty is a problematic for what he is thinking. But so there is this negative point, and then I think there is space for us to think coloniality also in his work, because he does also engage in Albert Memmi's work, the picture of the colonizer preceded by the picture of the colonized, something like that. Sorry if I butcher the titles, but he also engages in this space. So I think this is also a possibility for a larger discussion of a Brazilian philosopher who has his contradictions, who is a product of his time. He is dated, of course, but which leaves a space for us to think our condition as uh, heirs of a certain rationality which cannot be cannot be naturalized, which is, I think, to some extent, a way to turn critical theory in a traditional sense against itself, in a way to say, to think, look, okay, if this is a tool for us to think the narratives and its limitations and its mystification, uh, then let's see to which extent other narratives can also point to the blanks inside rationalization which lives outside these voices of the global south, so to say. So um, I think um, this is the main gist, I would say, of a thought that I'm developing, trying to engage in what Jeremiah proposed, and I am also working on this idea, thinking Boaventura de Souza Santos' work. Some of it I also put in my thesis, but this is something I wish to explore more in some articles, and I'm also open for us to furtherly engage in that in the future, perhaps. But I think this would be in general terms, what I'm thinking of and what I am involved in a way that I I firmly oppose a way of thinking uh, coloniality as a condition in which there is no conversation possible with what is called Western thought
Right.
right. I think this is certainly another form of dogmatization, of another form of ideologically closing the boundaries instead of trying to go beyond. But of course, when we try to go beyond certain boundaries, this involves a critique and involves in an exercise of thinking dialogue as a form of conflict. Of course, a conflict in intellectual terms, but which is not has not only to do with who is speaking and who is proposing this dialogue, but also conflict in viewpoints, which have their limits. And with that, just to really just to finish, I think there are also limits to the pedagogy of liberation as taught of by Paulo Freire, and these limits are systemic. So, of course, when we think of a pedagogy of liberation and a philosophy of liberation, to put it in Dussels terms, right, which has also a conversation with Paulo Freire, when we think of this, we are also thinking of the limits. Precisely, this is why we need a form of liberation, because there are limits that we observe in our own forms of thinking. So if I use Paulo Freire as an author into sort of to engage in something, of course, there will be limitations to this engagement, and there will be limitations of my mode of thinking in relation with the realities in other countries and the philosophy that is born of different realities, political, historical, cultural, so forth. So I think it's also important to think of the limits, systematic limits involved, without naturalizing these limits, of course. So it is possible to think beyond, but not to determine what is beyond necessarily. It's an open question, inconclusive. So I conclude inconclusively to hear now the other companions here.